Some of the biggest losers are women, doing hard time in federal prisons because they fell in love with the wrong man and got hit with stiff mandatory sentences based not on what they did, but on what their drug lord husbands or lovers did. Amy's mother was editor of the local newspaper, the Charleston Express. As a journalist, Nancy Ralston covered trials, but never imagined her own daughter would grow up to be a defendant. Amy's quiet country life changed dramatically when she dropped out of college and moved to Dallas in 1979.
When I'm in college, I meet a guy that works for Southwest Times Record, the newspaper there in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And he asked me if I would be a subject for him to go out and take some modeling photos. And he instilled in me that I really ought to pursue a modeling career.
Armed with glossies, a portfolio, and a dream, Amy pounded the streets of Dallas, trying to crack the glamorous world of modeling. Then one night in 1985, at a Dallas supper club, 25-year-old Amy Ralston met the man who would change her life. 44-year-old Sandy Povah, a successful Dallas attorney.
He was a Stanford Law School graduate, an attorney, successful, owned several businesses, worldly, interesting, fascinating, all that. He had been through an ugly divorce before me, and he's somebody who is really good about hiding secrets. We were in kind of a rocky relationship from the very beginning, so I am not somebody that he would want to arm with information in the event that we went through a divorce. After I was married to him, I realized that I was in an unhealthy relationship with somebody who had a split personality. There was Sandy, who I fell in love with, and then there was the other personality that we called Weird Harold. We even had a name for it. The only remedy to remove him from my life was for me to leave Dallas. I had to leave Dallas and I had to leave all my friends behind.
In January 1988, Amy left Sandy and moved to Los Angeles, where she took acting lessons, wrote a screenplay, and forged a new career as a professional party planner.
She was throwing the parties at Tramps at that time, and I attended those with her. There were always celebrities around her. There was Sly Stallone, James Coburn, Judd Nelson, Mickey Rourke. I remember being at her house one night and Julian Lennon was sitting playing on her keyboards.
Amy was earning about $100,000 a year, trying to put distance between her old life with Sandy and her new life in California.
After about a year, he was flying out to LA a lot, pursuing the relationship. He told me that he was going to Europe, and then I never heard anything for a while. The word got back to me that he'd been arrested. I hadn't been in Dallas in over a year, so the only thing I knew to do was to book a flight and go to Dallas and see if I could go through the house, listen to the answering machine, and try to piece this thing together, and eventually you think you're going to find out more information. And while I was in the Dallas house, the phone rang, and it was Sandy's German legal counsel who'd been assigned to the case in Germany. And at that time, he gave me very thin details, but said that Sandy had been arrested for manufacturing ecstasy and that he wanted me to retain an attorney for him there in Dallas. It was a pretty interesting revelation.
When Sandy was arrested on February 16, 1989, he and several co-defendants were charged in a wide-ranging conspiracy. And it was the word conspiracy that would later ensnare Amy Povah.
He wanted help, and he didn't care where it came from, and he knew the lady that loved him would still come to his aid and help him.
You know, I can read some of the letters that he wrote, and there's this other side to him that unfortunately I kept focusing on, which was this little boy charm that he had and this way of endearing himself.
I went into crisis mode, and then I got involved in a series of things that sucked me into the conspiracy statute.
And that's what we want to find out about now, because once you got over there with the attorney, you had to pay the attorney.
Yes,
and so he said to you, your husband said to you what?
He had hidden some cash in some places in Dallas, which I was unaware of prior to. And he wanted me to retrieve this cash, and he also wanted me to meet with somebody who owed him cash. I felt like, well, he's in a bad situation. let's just do what we can to try to relieve it.
I went around and collected some bail money. He thought he would get bail in Germany, and he actually said this is a huge mistake.
The feds busted into the house, and that was quite traumatic. They had me under surveillance. It really became a living hell.
7 months after Sandy's been arrested, and I pull into the garage. My car is rushed by law enforcement people who are screaming and have a gun out, and they're pointing it at my face. My house was ransacked, demolished. Kitchen had exploded. My living room was completely upside down, and somebody had to get a chair and put it upright before they tossed me into it. And there was a hole where my front door used to be, and I could see the courtyard. I wasn't going to say anything because I'm literally watching these people destroy my home. This isn't somebody that I really want to confide in.
On March 27, 1991, she was arrested at an apartment in Marina del Rey, near Los Angeles, tried in Waco, Texas in November 1991.
You don't have to be involved in every single part of that conspiracy in order to be liable for it, as long as you have made a willing decision to put yourself into the middle of, or even on the fringes of, a criminal conspiracy. You better watch out.
One of the most controversial things about the way the federal criminal justice system works now is something called the trial penalty. And so it's just become standard practice that prosecutor will go to a defendant and say, you know, you've been charged with a crime and you're either going to plead guilty and cooperate or we're going to crush you.
Perhaps the biggest irony of this case is that Amy Povah was never the primary target of the feds. Federal agents told Court TV they expected her to plead to lesser charges and avoid a trial.
I could not plead guilty to everything that they accused me of. So I pled not guilty, and ultimately I was convicted for conspiracy, and I received a 24-year sentence.
Amy had several people, including Sandy and some of the lieutenants, who could have been called to verify that Sandy had done all he could to prevent her from knowing about what he was doing. Those people weren't called. Her lawyer didn't call them. They never testified.
Conspiracy, which is most federal drug cases, if you further the conspiracy one step, they say you're guilty for everything that happens in the conspiracy.
When the jury came back with their verdict, Amy Povah was guilty on all charges. Her 24-and-a-half-year sentence was mandatory. The judge had no discretion. The sentence was based on the entire scope of Sandy's drug network, not on the scope of Amy's conduct or her degree of relevant participation.
My 24 years was established based on the sum total of all the ecstasy that Sandy had manufactured. That's where my years came from. My years didn't come from things that I did. It came from 3-point-something million tablets of ecstasy that he had manufactured, puts me on the chart at this level, which is 24 years. That's how a judge sentences you, based on a chart. To add insult to injury, while I'm incarcerated for 24 years, he comes back to the US and goes before the same judge that sentenced me to 24 years, and he got 3 years probation because he cooperated and snitched out everybody.
Your husband, now I assume ex-husband, you better be ex-husband.
Yes.
By giving a break to the person who gives the most information favors the kingpin.
So they can get convictions on everybody just from the kingpin. That's worth a lot in terms of this negotiating process. So the big fish goes back into this cesspool, and the little fish do the time for it.
I ended up in federal prison in Dublin, California. I realized that I would need to spend a lot of time in the law library, And I needed to familiarize myself with my case and everything that had gone wrong.
Amy Povah has already served 9 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. She's lost all her appeals and has no hope of parole. Meanwhile, Sandy Povah finished his 4-year term in Germany, came back to Dallas, divorced Amy, and has since remarried twice.
Glamour magazine was the first major publication to expose the conspiracy law and used my story to illustrate how it was impacting the women. And why that was such a catalyst was suddenly we had something tangible to hand to people.
I'm reading this quote from Charlie Strauss, assistant U.S. attorney from Waco, Texas, who told Glamour magazine in 1999, had she come to the table at that time, cooperated, been truthful, honest, and candid, I would say there's a probability she wouldn't have been prosecuted.
The community found out, and my brother got involved, and of course my father and Senator Bumpers and Senator Pryor, and everyone started actually looking into the case and seeing, well, what could have possibly happened here? This just doesn't seem right.
My story and case started gaining momentum, and we got, I think, up to 15 politicians who wrote letters supporting my clemency. I went to my case manager's office and walked in the door, and she said, where are you going to live when you get out of prison? And I said, well, I guess with my parents for a while. And she said, because I've got to set you up on probation. And I said, why? And she said, you're going home. And I couldn't process it. I was just like, and so my reaction was, I think I was sitting down, so I stood up, and then I sat down, and I stood up, and I sat down, and I said, what do you mean? And she said, you've gotten executive clemency. President Clinton has ordered you out, and you have to be out today by 5 o'clock.
The president had granted her petition, and she was home that afternoon, that evening. They let her out that day.
It was really great, because we always got bad news in there. Nobody ever got good news. And it was really nice to have all the women walk me across the compound. And there was that moment on the compound of victory. But it was really hard, too, because you have to leave so many people behind.